So we want to continue our conversation on biological energy and talk specifically about the gradients that are going to be important in keeping life going, and those gradients are going to ultimately make ATP. So this goes back now to some of our most important organelles, our semi-autonomous organelles, the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. And we had talked about the mitochondria being these sugar-burning factories of the cell. And here's a little bit more detail. Here's the chemical equation of kind of what's going on inside that mitochondria. We're going to see sugar, carbohydrate, plus oxygen is going to yield CO2. This is the CO2 literally that you breathe off when you exhale, water, and most importantly, ATP. So ultimately what we really want to get is the energy out of that sugar and make it into ATP, this form of energy, chemical energy, that we can use in the cell to drive the biochemical processes of life. So again, let's look at our eukaryotic cell, and we'll zoom in on that mitochondria here. Now, what we want to see is the mitochondria has two membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And that inner membrane is folded back and forth on itself. We do this to increase its surface area, because there's a whole series of enzymes on that inner membrane that are very, very important in generating energy. Okay, so you can see in this case the little lollipops are one of the many types of enzymes in the inner mitochondrial membrane. But if we focus on those little lollipops, they're in fact what we call ATP synthases. And ATP synthases are going to be the point at which we're actually making ATP. So how does this enzyme complex, this a bunch of different proteins all put together, how does this make ATP? Well, it taps into a gradient across the inner mitochondrial membrane. So here we can see this inner mitochondrial membrane is the membrane that we have cut in this picture. And above it is the space between the outer mitochondrial membrane and the inner mitochondrial membrane. And we're going to fill that up with protons, right? With hydrogen ions. And we talked about these when we talked about pH. So yes, this region is low pH. It's very acidic. There's a high concentration of protons here. And because we understand diffusion, the second law of thermodynamics, things are going to want to move from regions of high concentration to regions of low concentration. So all those protons want to move into the mitochondrial matrix, the other side of that membrane. And if you give them a channel to do that, they will take it. They will flow through that hole in the membrane to go from regions of high to regions of low concentration. And that flow, that movement, can be tapped into just like water over a water wheel. It is a source of energy. So the ATP synthase, this kind of lollipop-shaped enzyme complex that you see here, is actually the complex is going to tap into the energy source, be the water wheel, and take ADP, adenine diphosphate, plus a phosphate, and make ATP. And that ATP has got that little explosion around it. It's because it's full of energy. All right, we'll look at that molecule a little bit more closely in a second. But for now, I want you to think about that idea of diffusion now. This movement from high concentration to low concentration, this tendency in the universe for that to happen, is the source of our power. Right? Now, how do we create that gradient? Through a series of complex reactions of where you break down your food. Again, those reactions, we call it cellular respiration, is going to be the burning of the food and the ability then to pump protons into this space to make it concentrated. Right? And that is a whole several lectures worth of information that we're not going to go into detail in this course, but you can and you will in other courses. So cellular respiration is the reaction I want you to know. And that is the burning of our food. It requires oxygen, and that is going to allow us to establish this gradient. How do we tap into this gradient? We use the ATP synthase to allow the gradient to go from high concentration to areas of low concentration, and we use that flow, like the flow of water, through a dam to make ATP. In fact, here's a hydroelectric dam generator. And it looks a whole heck of a lot like an ATP synthase. In this case, you have a turbine with water flowing downhill, spins the turbine, you spin the generator, you create electricity. Literally, the ATP synthase spins as the protons move through it to force that phosphate onto ADP to make ATP. All right? So you have this continuing replenishing of ATP in the cell. So energy from catabolism, these are the this is the part of your metabolism for breaking down food, goes into ATP. We use that ATP to stay alive, basically, for the cells to keep doing all their biochemistry, and it becomes ADP in that process. And then as long as you keep eating, you can make more ATP. And so we have this circular ATP cycle going on here. So what does ATP look like? Let's take a look here. So here's a closer look at ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So we're going to see later this is basically the same nucleotide that we see in RNA. But what we're going to look at here specifically is these 3 phosphate groups on the on the left. So you can see the high charge, a lot of charge there. And this isn't exactly how it works, but you can think of it for now as all those negative charges crammed together. It doesn't want to be together. The molecule is relatively unstable. And that unstable molecule, because you have all those negative charges, is ready to give up the energy in that molecule. And so when you release one of those phosphates, going from ATP, hydrolysis reaction, you're going to get then energy out of there. So the phosphate plus the ADP is going to give up some extra energy in that molecule, and that's what we can use to power the processes of life. So that's about creating energy from breaking down food, cellular respiration in the mitochondria. Now, the chloroplasts have an equally important biochemical reaction going on. And this we called the solar sugar-making factories of the cell, right? So we only find chloroplasts in green plants. And here we're going to see CO2, okay, carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight, gives us sugar and oxygen. And if you've really been paying attention, you're going to see now that these 2 reactions, cellular respiration and photosynthesis, are kind of opposite of each other. We'll look at that more in just a second. But let's orient ourselves. Here's our eukaryotic plant cell, and we can see the chloroplasts in there. When we zoom in on the chloroplast, we see that these green thylakoid membranes inside the chloroplast. So chloroplasts actually have 3 membranes, an outer envelope, an inner envelope, and then the thylakoid membrane. And you'll study these compartments as you study more biochemistry and study photosynthesis in greater detail. But ultimately what we have is proteins in the membrane that are going to capture light energy. They're going to make ATP right away, but that ATP is used immediately in what's called the Calvin cycle to make sugar. So we're going to make the energy from the sun ultimately power the biochemical pathways for us to make sugar. So we can sum those 2 very, very important reactions into what I like to call the energy cycle. So you have sunlight coming in to the planetary system, captured by chloroplasts, photosynthesis, making sugar and oxygen. We then use that oxygen and that glucose to run cellular respiration in our mitochondria, and plants do as well. Because plants need to, the beauty of being a plant is that you make your own sugar, and then you can burn it when you need energy. We have to actually eat the plants to get that sugar from them. Whereas a plant, you don't need the animal. The mitochondria in plants and animals then burn the sugar with the oxygen, and they make ATP for cellular work. That cellular work ultimately gives off low-grade heat energy. And this is the dissipation of high-quality sunlight energy to low-grade heat energy, or IR, infrared. Now, that process of doing cellular work, making the ATP, gives off water and CO2, which are the raw materials then for chloroplasts to use for photosynthesis. So ultimately what you see here is energy from the sun moving through the planetary system. So everything that you do, every movement that you make is ultimately powered from the sun, as is the vast majority of all life on the planet. And so when you look at this, you can actually break it down and see respiration as glucose plus oxygen yields CO2 plus water and ATP. Photosynthesis is light energy, CO2 and H2O equals glucose and O2. And just like any mathematical equation, you can cross things out that are on opposite sides of the arrow. So glucose on the left cancels glucose on the right in photosynthesis. Oxygen on the left in respiration cancels out oxygen on the right in photosynthesis. CO2 and H2O the same way. What you get then as a net result is the light energy from the sun is the energy in ATP. All right? That's important. That's a vast, vast simplification, summary overview of basic biochemistry of kind of planetary systems. All right? Now, let's review up to this point before we move on to our final topic in this unit, kind of cells and how they work. And we'll talk about enzymes. But way back now, we want you to remember that matter is made up of atoms. Go back to the chemistry recordings, review those. Atoms can be combined to form molecules. The major macromolecules are based in carbon, because we can make those 4 bonds with carbon. It's very versatile, make these carbon skeletons, these hydrocarbon skeletons. From those hydrocarbon skeletons, we can build our 4 classes of biomacromolecules, the lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. We can organize these in the emergent property that we call life in a single cell. And the cell is then separated from its environment by this lipid-protein membrane, the plasma membrane, that delineates the cell. We have 2 major kinds of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Things have to move in and out of the cell. It's an open system. And because we have that system, we have those barriers, we can create energy. What then is controlling all of this stuff? Ultimately, it's enzymes. And enzymes are encoded by DNA, and that's our next unit when we talk about molecular biology. But these proteins we call enzymes are dictating how much ATP is made, how we break down ATP, when do we make lipids, how do we move things across the membrane, all those things. So let's move on to our next recording and talk specifically about enzymes and enzymatic reactions.